Hi everybody, welcome to an introductory crash course guide on Lost Ark Sorceress class. This will give a brief rundown of how the class plays, what benefits it provides to a party, order of skills to level while progressing to 50, builds for mobbing, burst damage, constant damage, and PvP, as well as super armors, cancel text, and a short outfit showcase for people keen on aesthetics. The guide is tailored to fit the needs of anyone who is currently playing the class in any playable region, whether you're currently in tier 1, 2, or 3. This video is chaptered so you can easily skip to the parts that are relevant to your needs. For context on my experience with her, I'm currently one of Korea's Sorceress rankers. My armory profile can be located in the description, and I play her every day on my Twitch channel. Sorceress is an elemental spellcaster who specializes in fire, ice, and lightning magic. Fire specializes in damage, burn, and destruction, lightning in damage, stuns, and stagger damage, and ice in identity gauge generation and freeze. You won't be picking just one element though, and you'll be using all three elements based on your needs in any given scenario. Sorceress's synergy or buff makes a target take 6% more damage from her party. It's a constant synergy which can easily be maintained, as her two main skills that can apply it have lingering effects which help the debuff duration last as long or longer than the skill cooldown. Sorceress's identity serves two functions. The first is that when the gauge is at least 30% filled, you can activate the left ability Amplify Magic to increase your damage output by 10% and halve the cast time of casting spells. When the identity gauge is completely filled, Amplify Magic becomes Mana Release instead. This buff increases your damage by 20%, halves the channel time of casting spells, reduces active cooldowns by 25%, and does a few extra things. Mana Release is also strengthened by her class engraving Ignition. Amplify Magic and Mana Release can be deactivated early, but in both cases, you'll be reduced to no gauge remaining. Otherwise, while in Amplify Magic and Mana Release, the gauge will rapidly deplete. The duration of these buffs are not modified by specialization, however, specialization increases the amount of gauge gained by spells, as well as the amount of damage both of these buffs provide. The second function of Sorcerer's identity on the right is Blink. This is a long-range teleport that has enemy phasing and tenacity super armor. It uses up 30% of your gauge in order to use, however in PvP, this amount is adjusted to 45%. Your hitbox can still be hit while you're blinking, and you're still completely vulnerable to damage. You can cast Blink while you're in Amplify Magic or Mana Release, but doing so also reduces the duration of these buffs since it also eats away from the same identity gauge bar. While leveling Sorceress, she gains access to a lot of her fundamental mobbing skills early on within the first couple of hours of gameplay. To make leveling as seamless as possible, we'll first focus on getting Tidal Wave to level 7, taking reduced cooldown and extra explosion. Next, for immediate damage to bosses and major enemies, we'll raise God's Wrath to level 7, taking increased area of effect and the extra explosion as well for more damage. From here, we can focus on maxing out God's Wrath and taking the first tripod on the last row, increasing its damage and further amplifying it while we're in the magic release state. While leveling, you can alternate between these two skills to clear packs of mobs without too much issue. When dealing with major bosses, you can do great damage by building up your identity gauge to 30%, activating the state immediately, and using God's Wrath. The benefits of filling up the gauge completely while leveling aren't so great, so we can instead take advantage of the weaker but more frequent Amplify Magic state instead. Later on, when we get the Great Fire skill, we'll use a temporary spec where we take both the mobbing damage as well as the boss damage in the first and second row tripod, so that the spell is flexible in both scenarios. These three skills are the core skills that can easily carry you to level 50. At level 50, your first step should be to make use of the two skill pages that are offered to you by default. We'll make use of one for mobbing and the other for raiding. Because we have to make some decisions on how we want to raid, we can start with the mobbing build, which is universal regardless of which class passive you decide to take. The main content of mobbing in Lost Ark is a daily instance called Chaos Dungeon. In here, the mobs are always relatively easy to kill, so we'll take several large area of effect skills to easily deal with them one after another. We take critical damage on God's Wrath because ideally, you'll want to eventually pick up an engraving passive called Preemptive Strike, which guarantees critical hits against enemies that have not yet been hit by an attack. This will only be used in your mobbing setup, and take your chances of scoring a critical hit out of the equation since it'll always be 100% on the first strike. The build grows as you gain more skill points and take additional AoE skills to help cover the gaps. Also, a small tip, because elite mobs drop buffs called Transcendent Ethers, which reduce all of your current cooldowns, you can always reliably use your Awakening skill on the first pull of the second room, and always have it up again by the time the boss comes out. Before we get into raid builds for boss damage, I should make it clear that there are variations of all of these builds, some options when it comes to preferred skills, and even the ability to play without any class engraving at all. I'll be sharing one build for each class engraving, which I know can work well, but definitely feel free to experiment with what's most comfortable for you. Ignition build focuses around powerful burst damage. Compared to its Reflux counterpart, it's naturally slower, moves slower, has no mobility, and outside of its burst does less damage in general. However, when Mana Release is active, Ignition deals unparalleled burst damage. This also requires you to be mindful of your teammates' synergy since you'll want to maximize your damage within your burst. Relatively good knowledge of encounters is also needed due to the nature of long cast time delayed damage. However, note that due to the randomness of fights, no matter how much experience you accrue, there will always be times where you'll occasionally miss, and there's nothing you could have done about it. If you can live with these caveats, then for the seekers of the biggest numbers and maximum burst, this is the build for you. Lost Ark doesn't snapshot stats on cast. This means that all damage that you deal is calculated at the time of impact, not at the time of skill input. This means if you cast Doomsday right before Mana Release is about to expire, you'll benefit from the double cast speed Mana Release provides. By the time the meteor actually lands and hits the target, Mana Release will have expired and you won't actually get the increased damage. As Mana Release halves all current cooldowns, and you can only get one rotation of skills in during its duration, you can unload your skills and activate Mana Release to quickly get them back before the buff duration ends. This is used in the core skill rotation where you cast Doomsday, activate Mana Release so that it benefits from the increased damage and instantly halves Doomsday's cooldown, and follow out with the rest of your skills as they come off of cooldown. Later on, with enough cooldown reduction, it's possible to squeeze in an additional Doomsday near the end of the buff's duration. In order to pull this off, you need either a high level cooldown reduction jewel starting in tier 2 gearing, or high enough swiftness and a lower level jewel to accommodate. It's technically possible to double Doomsday in tier 1 by going full swiftness, but doing so slows down your gauge generation to 2.5 rotations, and also greatly reduces the amount of bonus damage you get since your buff scales off of specialization. Due to the low speed and high cooldowns of the class early on, we'll be taking Fast Speed, Ignition, and Precision Dagger as our core engravings. Ignition and Precision Dagger are necessary to reach an adequate amount of crit rate, while Fast Speed is our level 2 to 3 engraving, which makes casting our primary skills more manageable. Later on, with more engraving points available, we expand the engravings to include Grudge and Master of Strikes, and finally replacing Precision Dagger with Cursed Doll in late T3 once sufficiently geared. If you're currently in late T3 and you don't have a high tier cooldown reduction gem for Doomsday, it's highly suggested to remain Swiftness on your secondary stat and continue using Precision Dagger so that you can comfortably double Doomsday. Unlike Ignition, which is centered around burst damage, Reflux has great freedom. This is a constant damage build which offers high mobility and deals consistent, solid damage throughout the entire fight. Little to no timing is required to play this build. Reflux disables the Mana Release identity skill, meaning that the identity gauge can only be used for teleporting. Besides for the cooldown reduction offered by Reflux, the build naturally uses high crit and crit damage tripods to deal a constant flow of relatively high damage. Compared to Ignition, whose damage is like a roller coaster with highs and lows, Reflux is a flat line. There is a casting variation in this build which uses skills like Great Fire and Doomsday, but we're going to focus on smaller, quicker skills that still deal decent damage. The focus of this build is minimizing downtime so that you can constantly pump out attacks. Having a high crit chance is vital for this build though, since it uses critical damage tripods, so we'll use Grudge, Reflux, and Precision Dagger level 2 to 3 once again in the low tiers to compensate for the lower stat cap. The beauty of Precision Dagger on this build though is that critical damage penalty is a flat additive amount, and so are the crit damage tripods found on many of the skills in this build. This means that the penalty from this engraving is significantly lower compared to Ignition. Later on, with more engraving points available, we expand the engravings to include Master Strikes and a 5th engraving in the player's choice. There's a lot of variation on endgame Reflux builds with the ability to go crit heavy or swiftness heavy, and using engravings like Cursed Doll or Adrenaline to fill out the build. Sorceress's role in PvP is a long-range disruptor. Among the casters, her range is top-notch and her skill kit is filled with all levels of crowd control. Lightning Vortex and Cold Call are your long-range pokes that can catch people off guard and even from off-screen. They're both persisting long-range level 1 crowd controls that can easily let you combo into something else. Squall, Tidal Wave, Reverse Gravity, and for those who take Frost Explosion are all powerful options to deal with players in close range, as these are your level 2 and level 3 CC options. Inferno is a long-range level 2 crowd control that knocks enemies up into the air and is relatively quick enough that they have difficulty getting out of it. Your two main damage dealing skills in this build are God's Wrath and Elemental React. The former takes a tripod to become a long-range skill that doesn't require channel, while the latter deals great damage to enemies that are caught in Lightning Vortex, Cold Call, or are just knocked down in general. And also, it knocks people down too. God's Wrath is easily landed on targets from a distance without their spacebar, but can also easily combo off of your Lightning Vortex, Cold Call, and even Reverse Gravity. While it can be tempting to use the Mana Release state though, it's incredibly important to hold onto her identity to make escapes in case someone decides to engage you. Sorceress doesn't have a lot of great options against a lot of the other closses in close range, so she must make use of what few tools she has to win those trades, and if she can't, she must run. Blink can also be used offensively though, in combination with her Awakening skill or Reverse Gravity to quickly catch an opponent off guard if you feel confident. Her Awakening is one of the weakest relative to other classes, but it's very fast, a massive area of effect, and if the target isn't in a level 1 super armor, it will drag them in and knock them down at the end. Sorceress doesn't have the craziest damage, but she instead acts more like a backline tactician. For this reason, she's not a class that requires impulsive fast reactions, battling super armor trades, but instead rewards PvP players who are excellent decision makers and know how to enable their teammates and take advantage of situations from a range, while also being aware of their escape options at all times. The Sorceress that is given free reign to cast is one that will win games for her team. For that reason, her greatest weakness is if she gets pinned down while also not having any identity gauge. A powerful melee class can easily lock her up with little options for her to fight back, and so it's critical during the decision making that you prevent these situations from ever happening in the first place. Like most other classes in the game, the preferred stats lean heavily on 1000 swiftness, 249 subdue, and 1 crit. While Sorceress doesn't have many super armor skills outside of the tenacity on Frost Explosion and Ice Arrow, there are 2 that are often overlooked that can save you in a pinch. They're your identity skills, Mana Release and Blink. Both of these skills offer tenacity during the animation. Blink is a little bit more obvious, but the animation where Sorceress puts her hand to her chest during Mana Release renders you immune to knock up and knock down during it. Another notable super armor is the channels of Doomsday, God's Wrath, and Great Fire, which all have level 1 super armor that make you immune to flinching. As you can cancel these channels simply by moving, you have an on-command level 1 super armor that you can use in a bind without wasting the skill. Much like most of the classes in Lost Ark, Sorceress can use her spacebar to animation cancel most end frames on her skills. However, for anyone who plans to make use of the 3 strongest skills in her kit, there are also a few special cancel techs that you can learn that can save you a few fractions of a second, which in fights is all it takes to end up missing your skills. The first is Great Fire. Normally at the end of the skill, your character recoils backwards for half a second before you can take action again. By priming God's Wrath, Doomsday, or Ice Arrow and casting any of them the moment the channel bar finishes, you can stop the recoil and immediately go into casting that skill. At the end of Doomsday and God's Wrath, there's also a brief delay before you can take action again. It can animation cancel into each other or Ice Arrow, but not into Great Fire. Sorceress's counter skill Squall is a mid-range conal counter. Like all counter attacks in Lost Ark, you must be standing in the head attack angle in order to land a successful counter on a boss that's currently in a counterable motion when they're glowing blue. Her counter has a relatively long cooldown and it has a small startup time, so you must use it quickly as soon as you see the counterable motion, or else it might be too late. For those who plan to raise the skill to a higher level, note that in the second row tripod, only the ice modification won't raise the cooldown of the skill. On the subject of why Sorceress doesn't use the mana shield, it's ultimately because you'll run out of mana if you use it. HP can be recovered with skills and potions, but mana has a finite regeneration rate. On top of that, the amount of mana consumed when hit is contingent on the level of the skill, so unless you max it out, it'll quickly deplete your mana before you even realize it. No one plays perfectly, and while the mana shield is active, your mana regeneration is reduced by 30%, and if you're struck by an attack, mana recovery halts completely for 3 seconds. The amount of mana consumed on hit is furthered in the PvP arena. It's a highly risky skill to use, and taking it in lieu of another damage skill is also a questionable choice to begin with. That being said, the 10% movement speed tripod on the second row is really nice, and can be a useful tool for general transportation on a mobility set. On the question of which Awakening skill is better, Incinerate can deal more damage if more than 4 to 6 meteors actually hit the target. But the first Awakening is typically far more consistent. Some people prefer Incinerate just for how fast it's cast, but in most cases, the first Awakening will provide more damage, identity gauge, and can be used as a long level 3 super armor in a pinch. That concludes this video guide. To end things off, here's a few ideas for outfits for your soon-to-be Sorceress. I also wanted to end things off by saying that you're gonna hear people talking about how Sorceress isn't so great in Tier 1. While there's some truth behind this, especially in regards to Ignition's performance in particular, nobody plans to play a class long-term based on their Tier 1 performance, which NNE will probably be zooming through anyways. Play whatever you like, however you like. I'm sure no matter what, you'll find what's fun. Good luck, and I look forward to all the promising new mages out there.